What if the most valuable piece of farmland in America wasn't a farm at all? What if it was an ordinary backyard hidden behind a suburban home? That sounds impossible, but for Jake Thompson, a small patch of land behind his house generates more than $10,000 every single month. No massive tractors. No hundreds of acres. No agricultural degree. Just a system so unusual that most people have never heard of it, even though its roots trace back to research connected to NASA. Today, Jake lives in a quiet neighborhood where nothing about his property stands out at first glance. His house looks like every other house on the block. His driveway is average. His lawn is neatly maintained. And yet, behind that ordinary fence is a business that produces more income than many full-time corporate jobs. What's even stranger is that only a few years ago, Jake wasn't an entrepreneur at all. He was working a regular job, earning a predictable paycheck, and following the same path millions of Americans follow every day. If you had met him back then, you would have never guessed that he would eventually turn a backyard into a 5-figure monthly income stream. Most people assume building a business requires a storefront, expensive equipment, investors, or years of specialized training. Jake had none of those advantages. What he did have was curiosity. While looking for ways to create additional income, he stumbled across an idea that seemed almost too unusual to be real. At first, he dismissed it. Then he started digging deeper. The more he learned, the more he realized that this wasn't just a hobby. It wasn't even a side hustle. It was a hidden opportunity sitting right in front of him. An opportunity that almost nobody around him understood. And once he saw the numbers, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The question wasn't whether the idea worked. The question was how something so simple could be hiding in plain sight while so few people were taking advantage of it. But before Jake could make a single dollar, he first had to understand exactly what this mysterious NASA-connected concept was, and why it had the potential to completely change the value of something as ordinary as a backyard. The surprising part was not how much money Jake was making. The surprising part was what he was actually selling. Most people would assume a backyard business earning serious money must involve premium vegetables, specialty fruits, or some kind of livestock. Jake tried looking into all of those options. The problem was that nearly every traditional backyard farming model came with limitations. Some required too much land. Others required expensive equipment. Many depended on weather conditions, seasonal demand, or long growing cycles. What Jake eventually discovered was something completely different. Instead of focusing on crops that filled grocery store shelves, he focused on products that solved a very specific problem. Products with high value, consistent demand, and surprisingly small space requirements. The first time he ran the numbers, he thought he had made a mistake. The math simply did not look real. A relatively small growing area had the potential to produce more revenue than an entire acre of conventional farming. That immediately got his attention. But there was another reason this opportunity stood out. Unlike many agricultural businesses, the process was highly controlled. Rather than depending entirely on outdoor conditions, much of the production environment could be optimized and repeated. That meant fewer surprises and more predictable results. The deeper Jake researched, the more often he kept encountering references to experiments conducted decades earlier. Scientists had been studying how plants and biological systems could be grown efficiently in limited spaces. The original goal had nothing to do with entrepreneurship. The goal was survival and sustainability in environments where resources were extremely limited. Yet many of the principles from that research turned out to have commercial value back on Earth. At that point, Jake became obsessed. Every evening after work he spent hours reading articles, watching interviews, studying production methods, and comparing different systems. He filled notebooks with calculations. He mapped out potential expenses. He estimated yields. He researched local buyers. Most importantly, he tried to answer a single question. If this opportunity was as profitable as the numbers suggested, why was almost nobody talking about it? Eventually he reached a conclusion. The opportunity itself was not hidden. The information was available to anyone willing to search for it. What was hidden was the connection between the science and the business. Most people saw an interesting experiment. Jake saw a market. Most people saw a growing technique. Jake saw a revenue model. And once he recognized that difference, he knew the next step was no longer research. It was testing the idea with real money, real equipment, and a real experiment in his own backyard. By the spring of the following year, Jake had reached the point where reading was no longer enough. He needed proof. Not from articles, not from online forums, and not from people selling courses. He wanted to see whether the principles he had been studying could actually produce results in the real world. The challenge was that he did not have a huge budget. After setting aside money from his regular job, he invested just enough to build a small pilot system in the corner of his backyard. Friends thought it looked strange. Neighbors were confused. Even Jake was unsure whether the experiment would work. But the entire goal was simple. Test the process on a small scale and let the numbers decide. What made the system different was the way it controlled growing conditions. Traditional farming fights against nature. Drought, temperature swings, poor soil, pests, and seasonal changes can all affect production. The method Jake was studying approached the problem differently. Instead of adapting to the environment, it attempted to engineer the environment itself. That concept fascinated him because it echoed many of the efficiency principles he had seen referenced in research connected to advanced agricultural studies. Every variable could be measured. Every adjustment could be tracked. Every result could be compared. For weeks, nothing exciting happened. Jake followed the process, recorded data, and made small improvements. Some days produced encouraging results. Other days revealed mistakes he had not anticipated. Equipment settings needed adjustment. Growth rates varied. Production cycles took longer than expected. More than once he questioned whether he was wasting his time. But then something changed. The consistency began improving. Output became more predictable. The numbers started matching the projections he had calculated months earlier. Suddenly the experiment no longer felt like a hobby. It felt like a business. The most important discovery was not how much he could produce. It was how efficiently he could produce it. When Jake compared the output from his compact setup against traditional growing methods, the difference was impossible to ignore. A relatively small footprint was generating results that seemed completely disproportionate to the space being used. That was the moment his mindset shifted. He stopped asking whether the system worked and started asking how large it could become. Yet one critical question remained unanswered. Producing something is one thing. Getting people to pay for it is something else entirely. Jake now had evidence that the process worked. What he did not know was whether there were enough customers willing to buy what he was growing. And the answer to that question would determine whether this backyard experiment became a profitable business or just an interesting project. For nearly 3 months, Jake had focused entirely on production. Every improvement, every adjustment, and every late-night experiment was designed to answer one question: could he consistently grow a high-value product in a small space? Now he faced a completely different challenge. Could he actually sell it? Most first-time entrepreneurs assume customers appear after the product is ready. Jake quickly learned that reality works the other way around. The market decides whether a business survives. If nobody buys, nothing else matters. Instead of spending thousands of dollars on advertising, Jake started small. He made a list of potential buyers within driving distance of his home. Specialty grocery stores. Local restaurants. Farmers markets. Health-focused retailers. Small distributors. Anyone who might value a premium product grown with a highly controlled process. At first, the responses were disappointing. Some businesses never replied. Others already had suppliers. A few were interested but wanted proof that Jake could deliver consistent quality every single week. That requirement became his biggest obstacle. Growing a product once is easy. Producing it reliably week after week is what separates a hobby from a business. Rather than getting discouraged, Jake used every rejection as market research. He paid attention to the questions buyers asked. They wanted consistency. They wanted freshness. They wanted predictable delivery schedules. Most importantly, they wanted confidence that he could scale production if demand increased. Slowly, Jake began refining not only his growing system but also his business model. Then one afternoon, everything changed. A local restaurant owner agreed to place a small recurring order. The revenue was not life-changing. In fact, the first order barely covered some of Jake's operating expenses. But the amount of money was not the important part. The validation was. For the first time, someone was willing to pay real money for something grown in his backyard. That single transaction completely changed how he viewed the opportunity. Within a few weeks, another customer signed on. Then another. Word began spreading among local buyers who were looking for reliable sources of specialty products. Because Jake was operating on a smaller scale, he could focus intensely on quality and consistency. That attention to detail became one of his biggest competitive advantages. By the end of the season, the backyard operation was generating more revenue than Jake had originally projected. Yet something even more surprising was happening. The business was revealing a pattern he had not expected. The real opportunity was not simply producing a premium product. The real opportunity was the economics behind the system itself. And once Jake fully understood those numbers, he realized he might be sitting on a business far larger than he had ever imagined. The moment Jake started tracking every dollar that entered and left the business, the opportunity became much clearer. Most people looked at his backyard and saw a small growing operation. Jake saw a system. And systems can be measured. By now he had enough customer orders to calculate real numbers instead of estimates. Every production cycle was documented. Every supply purchase was recorded. Every delivery was tracked. What surprised him most was not the revenue. It was the efficiency. Traditional farming often requires significant acreage, expensive machinery, fuel costs, irrigation systems, and large labor requirements. Jake was operating with a fraction of those inputs. His growing area occupied only a small portion of his property, yet it was producing premium products that commanded significantly higher prices than conventional crops. During a typical month, gross revenue ranged between $8,000 and $12,000 depending on demand and production volume. Some months were lower. Some were higher. But what mattered was consistency. Customers continued placing orders because they valued quality and reliability. Operating expenses were also lower than many people expected. There were costs for utilities, growing materials, packaging, transportation, and periodic equipment upgrades. But because the system was highly controlled, waste remained relatively low. That efficiency protected margins. Jake calculated that every square foot of productive space was generating substantially more value than he had originally imagined when he started the experiment. The economics became even more interesting when he compared labor requirements. Unlike many businesses that require employees before meaningful growth can occur, Jake was still handling most operations himself. That meant a large percentage of revenue remained inside the business. More importantly, he was learning every step of the process firsthand. If something failed, he understood why. If something improved, he knew exactly what caused it. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain production cycles consistently generated stronger returns. Certain customers placed larger orders. Certain products moved faster than others. Instead of trying to sell everything to everyone, Jake narrowed his focus toward the highest value. Opportunities. That decision increased profitability even further. Looking back, he realized that his biggest misconception had been assuming the business was about growing products. In reality, the business was about producing predictable outcomes. Buyers were not paying for plants, materials, or technology. They were paying for consistency. Once Jake understood that, every decision became easier. Yet the numbers revealed something else. If a relatively small operation could generate this level of revenue, what would happen if the same system were expanded? That question quickly became the most important question in the entire business, because the answer would determine whether Jake remained a successful backyard entrepreneur or built something much larger. As customer demand continued growing, Jake found himself facing a problem that most entrepreneurs would be happy to have. His production capacity was becoming the bottleneck. The same system that had helped him build a profitable operation was now limiting how much revenue he could generate. Every week brought new inquiries. Existing customers increased their orders. Potential buyers wanted larger volumes than he could comfortably supply. For the first time, demand was outpacing production. Instead of rushing into expansion, Jake approached the situation the same way he had approached every other challenge. He started collecting data. He tracked which activities created the most value and which activities consumed time without significantly increasing revenue. What he discovered changed the direction of the business. The biggest advantage was not the product itself. It was the repeatability of the process. Because every stage was measured and documented, Jake could predict outcomes with a high degree of confidence. If he doubled a certain part of the operation, he could estimate the expected output. If he increased capacity by a specific percentage, he could forecast future revenue with reasonable accuracy. That predictability gave him confidence to reinvest profits back into growth. Over the following months, he upgraded equipment, improved workflow efficiency, and reorganized the layout of the growing area. Small changes produced surprisingly large results. Tasks that once required hours could now be completed much faster. Production cycles became smoother. Waste decreased further. Customer fulfillment became more reliable. The numbers reflected those improvements almost immediately. Revenue moved closer to the upper end of his monthly range more consistently. Margins remained healthy because many of the improvements increased efficiency without dramatically increasing operating costs. What impressed Jake most was how scalable the underlying framework appeared to be. The same principles that worked on a small backyard operation could theoretically work on a much larger scale. That realization transformed his thinking. He was no longer evaluating a side business. He was evaluating a business model. Yet expansion introduced a new challenge that could not be solved with equipment or process improvements alone. More customers meant higher expectations. Larger orders meant greater responsibility. And maintaining the quality that had built his reputation in the first place would become increasingly difficult as the business continued growing. The question was no longer whether the system could generate income. The question was whether Jake could scale without sacrificing the consistency that made customers keep coming back. As the business continued expanding, Jake discovered that growth was not really about producing more. Growth was about maintaining standards while volume increased. That distinction became the foundation of everything he did next. Many small operations fail when demand rises because the systems that worked for 10 customers break down when serving 50. Jake was determined not to let that happen. Instead of relying on memory, he documented every step of the process. He created checklists for production cycles, quality inspections, packaging procedures, delivery schedules, and customer communication. At first, this seemed unnecessary for a relatively small operation. But Jake viewed every task as a future training manual. If someone else eventually joined the business, they would need a system that produced the same results every time. That focus on consistency began paying off almost immediately. Customers noticed that orders arrived on schedule. Product quality remained stable. Communication was reliable. In an industry where inconsistency often creates frustration, reliability became one of Jake's strongest competitive advantages. Over time, referrals started generating more business than direct outreach. Existing customers introduced him to new buyers. Restaurant owners spoke with other restaurant owners. Retailers shared recommendations. What began as a local experiment slowly evolved into a reputation-driven business. The interesting part was that very few customers cared about the technology behind the operation. They rarely asked about growing methods, equipment, or research. What they cared about was receiving a premium product exactly when they expected it. That realization changed how Jake thought about value creation. The science made the business possible, but execution made the business profitable. Looking back, he realized that many people who discovered the same information never achieved meaningful results because they became fascinated by the technology instead of focusing on the customer. Jake approached the opportunity differently. Every improvement had to answer a practical question. Would it improve quality? Would it improve consistency? Would it improve efficiency? If the answer was no, he ignored it. That discipline kept the operation focused and profitable. By now, monthly revenue had become increasingly predictable, and the business was operating far beyond what Jake imagined when he first started researching the idea after work. Yet a new possibility was beginning to emerge. If the entire operation could function as a documented system rather than depending on one person, then the business might not be limited by the size of a backyard at all. It could potentially be replicated, expanded, and scaled into something much larger than the original experiment ever intended to become. Several years earlier, the idea of expanding beyond a backyard would have sounded unrealistic to Jake. Now it was becoming a serious strategic decision. The business had reached a point where growth was no longer limited by customer demand. The market had already proven itself. Buyers wanted more product than the operation could currently supply. The real challenge was deciding how to scale without losing the qualities that made the business successful in the first place. Rather than rushing into a large facility or taking on significant debt, Jake followed the same philosophy that guided the original experiment. Expand one step at a time and let the numbers justify each decision. He increased production capacity gradually, testing each improvement before committing additional resources. Every expansion had to improve efficiency, maintain quality, and generate measurable returns. If it failed any of those tests, it was not worth pursuing. This disciplined approach protected the business from one of the most common mistakes entrepreneurs make. Many people scale based on optimism. Jake scaled based on evidence. As capacity increased, revenue followed. Existing customers expanded their orders and new buyers entered the pipeline. The systems he had documented months earlier became increasingly valuable because they allowed the operation to grow without creating chaos. Tasks that once depended entirely on Jake could now be repeated using clear procedures. Processes became assets. Knowledge became systems. Systems became growth. At the same time, Jake continued studying the industry. He paid close attention to emerging technologies, production methods, and changing customer preferences. He understood that staying competitive required constant improvement. The moment he stopped learning, someone else would eventually build a better operation. What surprised him most was how many opportunities existed beyond the original business model. New product categories, additional customer segments, and partnerships began appearing as the company's reputation grew. Each possibility opened another path for expansion. Looking at the business today, it is difficult to believe it started as a small experiment in a backyard. Yet Jake insists that the most important factor was never the technology, the equipment, or even the product itself. It was the decision to test an unusual idea instead of dismissing it. Because once the first experiment worked, every future step became a question of execution rather than possibility. And that realization completely changed the way Jake thought about opportunity, business, and what could be built from a surprisingly small piece of land. Looking back on the journey, Jake believes the biggest lesson had very little to do with agriculture, technology, or even business. The biggest lesson was learning how to recognize value where other people see nothing special. Most people looked at the same information and moved on. Most people looked at the same backyard and saw unused space. Most people assumed meaningful income required more land, more money, more experience, or more connections. Jake made a different decision. He chose to test an idea instead of dismissing it. That single choice changed everything that followed. When asked what he would do differently if he were starting from scratch today, his answer is surprisingly simple. He would focus on customers sooner. In the beginning, he spent months studying production methods, equipment, and technical details. While that knowledge was important, the real breakthrough happened when paying customers entered the picture. Once real demand was proven, every business decision became clearer. Revenue replaced assumptions. Customer feedback replaced guesswork. Market validation replaced uncertainty. For beginners, Jake recommends starting smaller than most people think they need to. Many aspiring entrepreneurs spend too much time waiting for perfect conditions. They wait for more money. They wait for more knowledge. They wait for more confidence. Jake believes confidence comes from action, not preparation alone. His first system was far from perfect. His first production cycles contained mistakes. His first sales conversations were uncomfortable. But every small step created information that helped him improve. The core principle that guides his business today is straightforward. Build systems, not just results. Results can disappear. Systems can be repeated. A successful month is valuable, but a repeatable process is far more valuable because it creates future successful months. That mindset allowed a small experiment to become a profitable operation and eventually a scalable business. The story is not really about a backyard. It is not really about technology either. It is about discovering that extraordinary outcomes often come from ordinary assets when they are combined with curiosity, discipline, and consistent execution. And for Jake Thompson, that realization turned an overlooked piece of property into something far more valuable than he ever imagined when the journey first began.